Climbing Mount Everest is a perilous feat, with freezing temperatures, razor-thin oxygen, and unforgiving terrain pushing the human body to its limits. But the dangers of the mountain don't stop there. It's the choices climbers make that often seal their fate. Misjudging the weather, overestimating their abilities, or running out of critical supplies can transform a dream into a deadly nightmare. In the death zone, even a minor error can become fatal. And when climbers ignore the risks or gamble with their lives, the consequences are chilling. In this video, we'll show what happens when bad decisions meet the highest mountain on Earth. It's May 15th, 1982. A team of American climbers is battling their way up Mount Everest. Among them is Marty Hoey, a strong, determined mountaineer who was known for her caution and skill. She had climbed some of the toughest peaks in the world, including Mount Rainier more than 100 times. Marty wasn't just a climber. She was a leader, a guide, and someone everyone trusted on the mountain. She was only a few days away from possibly becoming the first American woman to reach the top of Everest. At over 26,000 feet, the mountain turns brutal. This zone is called the death zone for a reason. The oxygen is so low that your body starts to shut down, even if you're just sitting still. Climbers have to move carefully, staying clipped into fixed ropes with their harnesses. This rope acts as a lifeline. If you slip or lose your balance, the rope will catch you and save your life. But to work, your harness has to be perfectly secured to the rope. On this day, Marty and her teammate Jim Wickwire were climbing a steep icy slope toward Camp 6, the next stop before their summit attempt. The slope was dangerous, 45 degrees with loose rock and snow underfoot. Every step was slow and deliberate. Marty and Jim had their harnesses attached to the fixed rope as they carried heavy gear. They were focused on setting up Camp 6 so the team could push for the summit. Then, it happened. Marty leaned back slightly, letting Jim move ahead on the narrow ledge. That's when her harness buckle opened. In a split second, she was no longer connected to the rope. Before anyone could react, Marty lost her footing on the icy slope. She slipped and gravity took over. She tumbled 6,000 feet, vanishing into a deep crevasse below. The entire team was in shock. One moment, Marty was right there, and the next, she was gone. Jim Wickwire later described the horrifying moment, saying it happened so fast that no one could do anything to stop it. Marty's body was never recovered. She fell into what her team leader, Lou Whitaker, described as the prettiest place that ever was. But that was little comfort to her devastated teammates. The mistake that caused Marty's fall was tragically simple. Her harness wasn't fully secured. The buckle had come undone. This kind of mistake might not seem like a big deal, but at that altitude, even the smallest error can cost you your life. Climbers know to double-check their gear constantly, especially in the death zone. But high on Everest, where the air is thin and exhaustion clouds your mind, even experienced climbers can make life-threatening mistakes. And sometimes, the risks aren't just about your own choices. They're about what others do or don't do when they find you in trouble. That's exactly what happened to David Sharp, a 34-year-old climber who froze to death in 2006 in a place now infamous among climbers, Green Boots Cave. His death wasn't just tragic, it sparked one of the biggest controversies in Everest's history. Let's start from the beginning. David Sharp was no amateur. He was a skilled mountaineer who had climbed some of the tallest peaks in the world, including Cho Oyu, the sixth highest mountain. He believed in doing things his way, solo, without guides, Sherpa support, or even extra oxygen. In 2006, he returned to Everest for his third attempt to summit, climbing with minimal supplies on a no-service expedition. That meant the company he hired, Asian Trekking, would only get him as far as the Advanced Base Camp, ABC. After that, David was completely on his own. But Everest is no place to take chances. Above 26,000 feet in the death zone, even the strongest climbers need every advantage. David had just 2 bottles of oxygen, barely enough for 8 to 10 hours of climbing. He carried no radio or satellite phone to call for help. His plan was risky, but he was determined. On May 14th, David set out for the summit from a high camp just below the northeast ridge. The climb was grueling, and by the time he approached the top, it was late in the day. This was his first critical mistake, climbing too late. On Everest, you're supposed to turn back by 2 p.m., summit or not, to avoid descending in the dark. But David pushed on. Whether he summited or not is still unclear, but by nightfall, he was in serious trouble. As he descended, David found shelter under a rocky overhang known as Green Boots Cave, named after the body of another climber lying there. At 28,000 feet, the temperatures were brutal, and David's oxygen had run out. He was freezing, frostbitten, and utterly exhausted. He huddled in the cave, arms wrapped around his knees as climbers passed by. Yes, you heard that right. Climbers passed him, over 40 of them. Some thought he was already dead. Others realized he was alive, but believed he was beyond saving. One group, led by Mark Inglis, a double amputee making history as the first to summit Everest with prosthetic legs, stopped briefly. They saw that David's hands and legs were frozen stiff, his face frostbitten. He was barely conscious. Inglis's team radioed their base camp for advice, but by then, they were running out of oxygen themselves. The advice they received was chilling. There's nothing you can do. Move on. Think about that for a moment. Imagine walking past someone dying, knowing there's nothing you can do. It's easy to judge, but in the death zone, your body is failing too. Every breath feels like a fight, and stopping for too long could mean your own death. Inglis himself was suffering from frostbite so severe he had to be carried partway down the mountain. But here's the hard truth. David's death wasn't just about the choices of those climbers. His own decision sealed his fate. He climbed alone, without a Sherpa or partner to help him if something went wrong. He carried too little oxygen, meaning he had no margin for error. And most crucially, he climbed without any way to call for help. No radio, no satellite phone. Even if someone wanted to save him, coordinating a rescue would have been nearly impossible. David's story is a reminder of Everest's unforgiving nature. It's not just about skill or determination. It's about preparation, timing, and knowing your limits. Without these, even the best climbers can find themselves in the death zone, alone and out of options. And sometimes, even love and loyalty can't save you, as we see in the haunting story of Francys Arsentiev, Everest's Sleeping Beauty. Francys Arsentiev and her husband Sergei shared a passion for the mountains. Together they had tackled some of the toughest peaks in the world, and in 1998 they set their sights on Everest. But Francys had an even bigger goal. She wanted to become the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was an ambitious and dangerous dream. Climbing without oxygen means your body is slower, weaker, and your mind foggy from the lack of air. It's a feat attempted only by the most elite climbers, and even then, it's incredibly risky. The couple decided to climb alone, with no Sherpas or teammates for backup. This was their first mistake. Without extra hands to carry supplies or help in emergencies, they were entirely on their own. They reached Everest's high camp at 8,300 meters on May 20th, where they waited for the weather to improve. Spending 2 nights in the death zone without oxygen was their second mistake. Even the best climbers limit their time in this deadly environment to avoid permanent damage to their bodies. Finally, on May 22nd, the weather cleared and they made their push to the summit. They were seen through a telescope at base camp, reaching the top late in the day. While this was a triumphant moment, it was also another critical error. Climbing late in the day left them descending in darkness, exhausted and exposed to freezing temperatures. As they made their way down, Francys began to struggle. The thin air and extreme cold took their toll, and she collapsed. Sergei made the heart-wrenching decision to leave her to find help. He began climbing back up with oxygen and medicine, but he disappeared in the night. His body was found a year later, suggesting he fell from the mountain while trying to save her. Francys, meanwhile, was found the next morning by an Uzbek team. She was frostbitten, unable to move, and fading fast. They tried to help her, giving her oxygen and trying to carry her. But without the right equipment, they couldn't move her far. They had no choice but to leave her behind. The next day, Francys was still alive when 2 climbers, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd, found her near the first step. Her condition was dire. Her face and hands were frozen and waxy white, and she couldn't focus her eyes. She could barely speak, but begged them not to leave her. Ian and Kathy were torn. They knew they couldn't save her. She couldn't sit up, let alone walk, and carrying her down the steep icy slopes was impossible without a stretcher. They stayed with her for a time, giving her oxygen and trying to comfort her. But eventually, they had to make the agonizing choice to leave her there. Francys died where she was left, at 40 years old, becoming one of Everest's most famous casualties. Her body, lying peacefully in the snow, earned her the nickname Sleeping Beauty. For nearly a decade, she remained a landmark on the mountain, a poignant reminder of both the beauty and cruelty of Everest. In 2007, Ian Woodall returned to the mountain to move her body off the main route and give her a more dignified resting place. Francys's story highlights a heartbreaking truth. Climbing Everest requires absolute preparation and teamwork. Without supplemental oxygen, a support team, or proper equipment, her chances of survival were slim. Even her husband Sergei, with all his experience, couldn't pull her back from the edge. If they had climbed with Sherpas or carried radios for communication, their fate might have taken a different turn. On Everest, every decision counts, and even the smallest mistakes can be fatal. This brings us to Vitor Negrete, a man whose passion for mountains drove him to make history, at a terrible cost. Vitor Negrete grew up in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with an insatiable love for adventure. As a kid, Vitor was fascinated by mountains, devouring every book he could find about them. That curiosity turned into action when he began climbing smaller peaks and honing his skills. His determination and bold spirit inspired everyone around him. Whether he was competing in adventure races or leading expeditions, Vitor never backed down from a challenge. By 2005, Vitor was already an accomplished climber with a solid reputation. That year, he summited Mount Everest for the first time using supplemental oxygen, an incredible achievement in itself. But Vitor wasn't satisfied. He wanted to push his limits further. The following year, he returned to Everest with a new goal: to summit without oxygen. This was a daunting task. Only a tiny fraction of climbers have ever done it. On May 17, 2006, Vitor left base camp to make his second attempt on Everest. This time, he made the ascent without supplemental oxygen, Sherpa support, or even a satellite phone. That was his first mistake. Without a Sherpa to assist him or a phone to call for help, Vitor was completely alone on the mountain. If anything went wrong, there would be no one to help him. Despite the odds, Vitor reached the summit on May 18th, becoming the first Brazilian to climb Everest without oxygen. It was a historic moment, but it also marked the beginning of the end. Exhausted from the grueling climb, Vitor began his descent. As the hours passed, his condition worsened. The lack of oxygen, the extreme cold, and sheer exhaustion were taking a toll. Sometime during his descent, Vitor fell dangerously behind schedule. His Sherpa, Ong Dawa, who had remained at Camp 3, grew concerned when Vitor didn't return within the expected time. Realizing something was wrong, Ong Dawa climbed up to search for him. By the time the Sherpa reached him, Vitor was barely able to move. Together, they tried to make it back to Camp 3, but Vitor's body was shutting down. He collapsed just before reaching the safety of the camp and died shortly after. If Vitor had carried oxygen, he might have had the energy to make it back to Camp 3. If he'd climbed with a team, they could have supported him during the descent. On Everest, you need every advantage you can get. Even for someone as strong and determined as Vitor, the mountain's challenges proved too great to face alone. The same was true for Hristo Prodanov, a man whose fearless spirit and groundbreaking achievements in mountaineering pushed the boundaries of human possibility. Hristo was a Bulgarian climber who took on Mount Everest in 1984, determined to conquer it alone, without supplemental oxygen, and by the most difficult route, the West Ridge. His triumph made history, but his descent ended in tragedy. Hristo's love for climbing began in his youth, and by the time he was a student, he was already scaling major peaks. Over the years, he gained a reputation as a mountaineer of remarkable skill and endurance. He climbed the highest mountains in South America, the Alps, and the Hindu Kush, becoming the first Bulgarian to summit Lhotse without oxygen in 1981. But Everest was the dream he couldn't let go. In April 1984, Hristo set out on a solo expedition to climb Everest by the dangerous West Ridge route. This path is known for its extreme weather and technical difficulty, and climbing it without oxygen made it even more perilous. Most climbers wouldn't even consider an Everest attempt in April because the weather is notoriously unpredictable. But Hristo was undeterred. His goal was clear: to be the first Bulgarian to stand on top of the world. On April 20th, Hristo reached the summit of Everest at 6:15 p.m. It was a groundbreaking achievement. He was the first to conquer the West Ridge without oxygen. But here's where things took a fatal turn. Climbing Everest late in the day is incredibly dangerous. The descent, especially in darkness and plunging temperatures, is far more difficult than the ascent. This was Hristo's first critical mistake. As night fell, Hristo began his descent alone. He radioed his team the next day to report that he had lost his gloves, another devastating mistake. Without gloves in the freezing temperatures of the death zone, frostbite sets in quickly, robbing climbers of the ability to use their hands. By the afternoon, Hristo was too weak to press the radio button long enough to speak. His voice faded, and he was never heard from again. His body was never found. So, what could have saved Hristo? First, climbing with a team would have provided support and backup if something went wrong. Second, supplemental oxygen, a common theme we keep seeing in these tragic cases, could have reduced exhaustion and kept his mind sharp during the descent. And finally, proper timing. Reaching the summit earlier in the day might have allowed him to make it back down safely. On Everest, even the smallest mistakes can have deadly consequences. And for Hristo, the price of his boldness was his life.